What if the place sold as the crown jewel of an empire quietly turns into the territory its own people are desperate to escape? Because that is exactly the question now hanging over Crimea in late August 2026. A peninsula that Moscow spent 12 straight years promoting as the proof of imperial revival is now the place where 1.4 million people are stuck in darkness. Fuel is rationed to the state. Families sit for hours in summer heat on the only road out. And Russian settlers who once sang the praises of annexation are openly telling each other that this place is collapsing in plain view. The headlines keep moving, but the picture behind them is now the same story repeating itself week after week. If that opening line just made you stop scrolling, hit like right now, tap subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of this war, and share this video with one person who still believes Crimea is the stable crown jewel of the Russian Empire. For 12 years, the Kremlin called Crimea the crown jewel of modern Russia. New highways were built across the peninsula, new resorts were opened along the southern coast. New propaganda posters promised prosperity, safety, and a permanent return to the motherland for Russians who had lived through the chaos of the early 1990s. Millions of Russian settlers poured in after 2014. They bought apartments. They opened cafes. They sent their children to local schools. They told their parents, back in Moscow, Krasnodar, and Vladivostok, "Come visit. It is beautiful here. It is ours again. It is forever." Forever, it turns out, was a word with an expiration date. Today, on August 26, 2026, the peninsula that was sold to Russian audiences as proof of imperial revival looks more like a territory in managed collapse. The New York Times reported on July 27, 2026, that Ukrainian drone strikes had cut power to the homes of 1.4 million Crimeans out of a pre-war population of 2.5 million. Read that sentence again and let it settle. 1.4 million people. That is more than half of the entire peninsula. That is not a localized outage. That is not a temporary inconvenience. That is a structural failure inside the most heavily defended Russian territory outside the mainland heartland. CNN reported in late June that Russian-installed authorities had been forced to declare a state of emergency across Crimea after weeks of intensified strikes. Officials admitted on the record that repair crews could not safely work on the grid while drone alerts were sounding. So the lines stayed broken. So the substations sat damaged. And so the people kept sitting in the dark night after night, week after week, with no clear answer about when the lights would come back. The Russian-installed governor of Sevastopol, Mikhail Razvozhayev, was forced to confirm publicly that electricity restrictions would continue because repair work had been suspended following repeated air raid alerts prompted by Ukrainian drone activity. The fuel story is even more telling. Crimea's occupation authorities confirmed that gasoline would only be sold to government agencies, not to ordinary civilians or private businesses. That single policy tells you more about the true state of the occupation than any official statement ever could. When the state hoards fuel for its own vehicles and tells the rest of the peninsula to wait, the message is unambiguous. The priority is the war machine. The civilian population is a side concern, and that side concern is shrinking every single week. Reuters reported earlier in July that fuel shortages across Crimea had become severe enough that private rail operators refused to send fuel wagons onto the peninsula because insurance companies were no longer willing to cover the war risk. That is a brutal sentence, because it means private capital is making the same calculation that ordinary people are now making in their kitchens. Crimea is no longer a place where the future feels safe enough to invest in. If this breakdown is actually changing how you see the war, hit like, subscribe before the next update drops, and send this video to one friend who still treats Crimea as a frozen front that nobody can touch. Now let's look at the beach, because the beach was supposed to be the last civilian function of the peninsula. The Observer reported on August 24th, 2026, that Russians were openly describing chaos on Crimean beaches. Tourists who had paid for family holidays were watching air raid warnings flash across their phones between swims. Some wanted to leave early. Many could not, because gas stations were empty. Children sat in hotel rooms while distant explosions shook the windows. Stranded families discussed whether to risk the bridge or wait out. The sirens. One resident of Sevastopol told CNN that drone interceptions were now happening directly above the city rather than above the Black Sea, as used to be the case. That is a chilling change. It means the war has moved in. It is no longer something happening out at sea. It is something happening overhead. Intent Press reported that housing prices inside Crimea have collapsed since the strikes intensified. Apartments that used to sell for around 180,000 rubles per square meter were now listed at roughly 130,000. That is a drop of nearly 28% in a market the Kremlin guaranteed as untouchable. And that figure did not include the most recent wave of attacks. Listings were piling up. Buyers were disappearing. Sellers were racing to exit before another strike wave made their property unsellable entirely. But that is only the economy of the peninsula. The economy of the people who lived there, the small businesses, the family cafes, the kiosk owners, the lifeguards on rented beaches, has been destroyed faster than any official statistic can track. Restaurant owners told Russian outlets that they could not keep staff. Hotel managers said cleaning crews no longer showed up because employees had moved their families north. Taxi drivers parked their cars because fuel cost more than the fare, and the summer economy that Kremlin propagandists used every year to showcase the benefits of annexation has been quietly written off. The Moscow Times reported on August 3rd that at least 11 civilians were killed in a single wave of Ukrainian strikes across Crimea and southern Russia. Local authorities confirmed the toll. And the most important detail in all of that reporting was not the number. It was the consistency. Strikes were no longer a once-in-a-month event. They were becoming a routine feature of life on the peninsula. And once that routine is normalized, the population starts making decisions that war planners cannot control. Decisions about whether to send the kids to school in September or to pack the car and leave in August. Now let's walk through the most striking piece of evidence on this story, and it is the bridge. There is essentially one road connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland, the Kerch Bridge. CNN reported that during one overnight closure caused by a drone alert, more than 2,800 vehicles lined up on the Crimean side alone, waiting to get across to safety. Most of them were trying to leave. Almost twice as many cars were trying to exit Crimea as were trying to enter. That is a very clear behavioral signal. When the dominant direction of traffic flow is outward, you do not need a political scientist to tell you what is happening. Medusa, citing local Crimean sources, including Krim.Realii, reported that queues at the bridge had repeatedly stretched past 40 kilometers on the Russian side and more than 30 kilometers on the Crimean side. Wait times of 5, 6, or even 10 hours had become routine. Drivers brought water bottles for their children. Drivers used plastic bottles as toilets because there were no sanitary facilities. Elderly passengers were pulled from overheated vehicles by volunteer rescuers. Local travel advisories warned drivers to bring their own food, water, and supplies because nothing would be available inside the queue. One Kerch resident told Krim.Realii, on condition of anonymity, the trip back was absolute hell. I sat in traffic for 4 hours before the bridge. I knew what I was in for, so I brought water, but for the bathroom, I'm sorry, I had to use a plastic bottle. I just don't get people who risk their own health and their kids' lives to come to Crimea, where you hear explosions every day and people get heat stroke daily in those lines to the bridge. That is the human detail the propaganda cannot hide. Here is something else the headlines keep missing about the Crimean collapse. The water story is every bit as serious as the power story, and it deserves your attention right now. Before 2014, Crimea received roughly 85% of its fresh water through the North Crimean Canal, which diverted water from the Dnieper River across the Ukrainian mainland border into the arid northern steppe of the peninsula. After Russia seized the canal head in 2014, Ukraine cut the flow. Moscow's engineers promised that treated reservoir water, groundwater wells, and desalination units would plug the gap. For a few years, those promises appeared to work. Crimean agriculture dramatically shrank, but domestic water still flowed. That is no longer true in 2026. Reservoir levels in the peninsula hit historic lows by midsummer. Local occupation authorities restricted residential water pressure in major cities, including Simferopol, Yevpatoria, and Kerch, to just a few hours per day. Families reported filling bottles at public standpipes. Hotels told guests that showers could only be taken between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. Schools told teachers to bring packed water because drinking fountains no longer worked. The desalination units installed with great fanfare were operating at a fraction of their nameplate capacity. Suction pumps failed because they could not be properly serviced under blackout schedules. That is one more piece of critical infrastructure that the system now treats as optional. And when a peninsula can no longer guarantee drinking water to its own residents, the symbolic weight of crown jewel begins to feel very hollow indeed. Quick pause if this script is hitting harder than what you usually see on YouTube. Tap like, hit subscribe, and share this video with one person who thinks Crimea is locked down, stable, and untouchable. Here's the part that gets even more uncomfortable, and it is the part the mainstream media is not focusing on enough. The American, the Institute for the Study of War, and the Ukrainian partisan movement, ATESH, both reported this summer that the people leaving Crimea are not just tourists. They are soldiers attached to the Black Sea Fleet. They are FSB security personnel. They are occupation administration officials and their families. These are the insiders. These are the people whose families had priority access to housing, schools, and supply. Alesh reported that occupation officials and FSB personnel had been quietly evacuating their families and shipping valuables out of the peninsula since at least June. According to partisan tracking, some officers chose to evacuate their wives and children without waiting for official orders. That is a powerful signal in any system. In an authoritarian system where loyalty is enforced, the quiet internal evacuation of officials and their families is even more powerful, because it implies that people inside the system no longer believe the official story about safety. This is the moment to listen closely to what Russian voices inside Crimea are saying. Alexander Gorny is a longtime Russian blogger who moved to Crimea in 2014, built his audience around marketing the peninsula as a proud Russian success story, and until recently was one of the loudest defenders of the annexation. In mid-August, he published a post on Facebook, later amplified by the Telegram platform Dialogue UA, in which he wrote that trust in Russian administrators had collapsed. He said his acquaintances were quietly preparing to move back to the mainland, and he gave a date. The end of September, or perhaps sooner, was when he believed the situation would reach a breaking point. That is not an opposition voice writing from Berlin. That is a Russian settler writing from Simferopol. That is a father whose children attend Crimean schools. That is a man whose livelihood depends on Crimea staying functional. When that voice publicly predicts collapse on a specific timeline, it is far more credible than 1,000 cables from Western capitals warning about instability. Because this man is not warning. He's reporting from inside, and he is not alone. Dmitry Steshin, a war correspondent for the Russian outlet Komsomolskaya Pravda, openly questioned whether vacations in Crimea were even safe in the current moment. Russian Z channels, the same pro-war telegram networks that once cheerfully posted footage of frontline heroes, warned that gasoline depots across Crimea had been hit and that there were almost no safe places left to store imported gasoline. One channel described the situation bluntly as the total collapse of the fuel system. Leonid Ivashov, a retired Russian general, went even further. He wrote bluntly that farmers in Crimea would not be able to harvest crops because there was no fuel and that food shortages would follow before the year was out. He warned that Crimea and Sevastopol could be completely cut off from Russia and that starvation was already knocking on the door. This is not one warning. It is a chorus, and the chorus is mostly Russian. Now, what is Moscow doing about it? Reuters reported earlier this year that Moscow was preparing to remove Crimea's occupation governor, Sergei Aksyonov, from his post after the September elections. According to Ukrainian intelligence sources verified by ATESH, the strategy was the oldest strategy in the Russian political playbook. Find a scapegoat, remove the face, claim the local leader failed, never admit that the war itself is producing the collapse. Possible successors include a police general associated with the internal affairs structure or a military commander elevated through the so-called Time of Heroes program that places war veterans in political roles. In recent weeks, Aksyonov has been seen scolding subordinates on camera, threatening local deputies, and putting on what observers described as a situation is under control performance for Moscow, but on a peninsula where hotel reservations have collapsed by roughly 70% compared to the previous summer, there are very few buyers for that kind of show. He knows the script. He knows Moscow wants a scapegoat after the elections. He knows the September date. What he does not know, or at least cannot publicly say, is how to keep the peninsula lit, fueled, fed, and inhabited through another winter. Because scapegoats do not fix substations. They do not restore ferry service. They do not bring back tourists. They do not stop the queues on the bridge. They only buy Moscow a few news cycles before the next, and failure forces another explanation. And here is the deeper truth that nobody in the mainstream is saying loudly enough. When a peninsula that Russia has controlled for 12 years, defended with thousands of troops, paid for with billions of rubles, and promoted as the crown jewel of the empire, is now suffering fuel rationing, scheduled blackouts, multi-hour bridge backups, falling property prices, and a slow exodus of its own settlers, that is no longer a local news story. That is a strategic fact. It tells you something important about the war itself. It tells you that the kind of pressure Ukraine is applying, slow, multi-domain, persistent, is working. And it tells you that occupying Ukrainian territory in 2026 is far more expensive than the Kremlin ever priced into its war calculations. If you want more honest, no-hype commentary like this, hit like, subscribe so you stay ahead of the next shift, and share this video with one friend who wants clarity instead of slogans. Now let's do the math that nobody on cable news is doing. The New York Times said 1.4 million people had lost power. The average Russian household is about 2.5 people. That means somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 households on the peninsula are sitting in the dark during strikes. Add the smaller towns without water, the shops that lost refrigeration, the schools that lost heat, the pharmacies that lost backup power for routine procedures. Each of those households is making a private calculation. How long will we stay? How long can we afford this? When is the right moment to sell? When? Should we send the kids north for good? Multiply that calculation across the whole peninsula, and you get the early shape of a real demographic collapse. Not a dramatic headline stampede, but a slow drip of decisions, one family at a time, one bus at a time, one for sale listing at a time. That is how empires losing occupied territory usually look in their final stage. Not a sudden retreat, a quiet demographic surrender. 1,000 people every week choosing the future over the symbol. And there is a strategic reason this matters even outside Crimea. If the most heavily defended Russian-controlled territory in the war is showing this kind of slow-motion decay, the same pressure logic can apply to other occupied zones. Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson. Everywhere the occupation has been built on a combination of a force, infrastructure, and settler migration. Strip one of those pillars away and the structure starts cracking. Strip two and the cracks widen fast. Strip all three, as is now visibly happening on the Crimean peninsula, and the entire story changes. The cost of staying becomes more painful than the cost of leaving, and once that happens, even the most loyal settlers start voting with their feet. What happens next? 3 scenarios stand out. The first is managed deterioration. Moscow pours money in, reroutes fuel by military convoy, hardens key sites, increases subsidies for occupation officials, and accepts that Crimea will be expensive, stressful, and politically embarrassing for years. In that scenario, Crimea does not fall. It decays. The second is an accelerated outflow, more strikes, more outages, more bridge closures, a peninsula that enters winter in darkness. That combination could push hundreds of thousands more to use the bridge before they cannot. In that scenario, Crimea empties in slow motion, and Moscow quietly loses one of its defining political symbols. The third is a forced retreat. A future Ukrainian campaign creates real military pressure on the peninsula. Russia withdraws. Crimea stops being a symbol of victory and becomes the first major piece of territory Russia is forced to give up since the full-scale invasion began. None of those scenarios require a black swan event. All three can come from the same ongoing pressure that is already visible in the August 2026 data. The Ukrainian pattern of strikes on military logistics, energy infrastructure, transport choke points, and rotating occupation targets is producing exactly the conditions that all 3 scenarios need: time, erosion, loss of confidence, quiet demographic decisions that compound week after week. That is the deepest point in this entire story. This is not a moment, this is a momentum. Now turn the camera around and look at what this means for the wider military. Picture. Crimea was always more than a trophy. It was a forward operating base for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, a staging ground for southern theater offensives into Kherson and Zaporizhia, and a logistical transit point for Russian rail traffic moving fuel, ammunition, and replacement units to the southern axis. If the peninsula's grid collapses in winter, those bases lose power too. If fuel shipments cannot safely land, naval refueling becomes harder. If rail bridges keep being struck, ammunition depots cannot be resupplied at the tempo the front demands. That is the deeper calculation underway inside Ukrainian military planning. Not a single dramatic liberation strike, but a slow, patient, multi-month squeeze that drains the southern theater of the very capacity it depends on to keep fighting. Think of it as a tourniquet being tightened 1 notch per week. By the time someone inside the Kremlin notices the actual crisis, the limb below the tourniquet may already be gone, which means Crimea is not merely collapsing as a society, it is also starting to collapse as the military anchor for the entire Russian southern war effort, and the pattern is reinforcing itself. The Crimea platform, an independent monitor tracking the situation inside the peninsula, reported in its August 12th weekly update that Ukrainian forces had struck the Fardiskin military airfield and temporarily occupied Crimea. United 24 media reported that 2 rail bridges vital for Russian military logistics had been hit, along with a naval drone facility. Pravda Ukraine reported on August 1st that Ukrainian strikes had hit a drone depot and a Russian reconnaissance unit on the peninsula. Critical Threats Project summarized the situation in a single phrase: Ukraine's drone campaign against Crimea's power grid has been steadily widening, while attacks on shipping have produced a blockade effect that makes resupply harder and more expensive every week. Quick pause. If this video helped you understand what is really happening on Crimea, hit like now, subscribe so you don't miss the next update, and share this with one person who wants honest war analysis instead of headlines. Each one of these strikes is not just a tactical event. It is a small contribution to a larger campaign designed to make Crimea less livable, less governable, and less valuable. And the genius of that campaign is that almost none of the individual strikes look dramatic on their own. The press does not lead with them. The public does not follow them. But the cumulative effect is unmistakable. Sevastopol, the largest city on the peninsula, is operating on what occupation authorities themselves acknowledged was a step backwards from earlier blackout schedules. 6 hours without power, 2 hours with power. That is officially announced. That is not a rumor. That is the local government admitting on the record that the grid deficit has grown so large that the older 3-on, 3-off schedule can no longer be maintained. When local officials start publicly budgeting electricity like that, they are telling the population, in effect, that the worst is not behind them. It is in front of them. And the population hears that signal. It changes how they buy groceries. It changes how they plan travel. It changes whether they fix the apartment or sell it as is. It changes whether they trust the next announcement. And it changes the speed at which people decide to leave. And then there is the price story that nobody on cable news is following closely enough. Property listings across Simferopol, Yalta, Sevastopol, and Kerch have been quietly piling up throughout August. Realtors who used to charge premium fees now compete for the same shrinking pool of buyers. Some sellers have cut their asking prices by 35 to 40%, far more than the 28% drop already published. Some have simply given up and listed at any price. Many have moved to Krasnodar Krai, where living costs are lower, the war has not yet reached, and the school year can begin on schedule. The migration data is so severe that pro-Russian telegram channels have started warning about a second wave of 2022, comparing the current outflow from Crimea to the early exodus from Kherson and parts of Zaporizhia before they were formally absorbed. Then there is the agricultural story, and it is even more dangerous because nobody on cable is covering it. Crimean farmers warned as early as June that there would be no clean fuel for the harvest. Tractors sat idle in August. Grain fields sat unharvested. The warm weather crops that normally feed local markets through autumn were left in the ground. Leonid Ivashov warned that farmers could not harvest crops because there was no fuel. Local telegram channels confirmed that combine operators had parked machines for 2 months running. Fruit orchards were abandoned because workers could not reach them. Dairy farms cut output because refrigerated trucks could not run on the rationed fuel schedule. Within weeks of the official August 26 reporting, food prices in Sevastopol and Simferopol markets had outpaced every other regional market in occupied southern Ukraine. And in some categories, they were already approaching the same level as Moscow, a city roughly 1,300 kilometers away with a completely different supply base. Some families described standing in line for 2 hours at one of the few functioning bakeries and then leaving with half a loaf because the oven had been turned off mid-bake to comply with blackout rules. Some described buying vegetables from neighbors who had small garden plots because the local shops had run out. Some described trading with returning soldiers at informal markets, exchanging family savings for blocks of butter and bags of flour. And then there's the question that nobody in the West is asking loudly enough. What happens to the children? Occupied Crimea's schools were scheduled to reopen on September 1st for the new academic year. Teachers were told to prepare classrooms. Parents were told to buy uniforms. But by the 3rd week of August, teachers were quietly texting each other on whether to report to work at all. Some said their school buildings still had no working windows, no functioning heating, no internet, no backup generators. Some said parents had already moved their children north to relatives in Krasnodar Krai and refused to bring them back. Some said attendance projections were running at less than half of last year's numbers. Those teachers, who once enjoyed the prestige of working in the most propagandized schools in occupied Ukraine, were now quietly counseling parents to keep their kids home until the situation stabilized. That instability may never come. The strikes have not slowed. The fuel has not returned. The blackout schedules have tightened. And as winter approaches, parents who left are unlikely to come back, and parents who stayed are increasingly unlikely to keep their children in classrooms that freeze in January. That is the simplest way to understand what total isolation really means here. Not a military siege, not a coastline blockade, something quieter and more corrosive. Total isolation is the moment. A population stops trusting that staying where they are will get better and starts acting on that belief at scale. It also means isolation of the peninsula's economy from the wider Russian financial system, in a way the Kremlin cannot easily reverse. Crimea already lost most foreign tourism years ago. Now it is losing internal Russian tourism too. Hotels that once filled in July are now booking at fractions of previous years. Restaurants that depended on August vacation traffic are cutting staff or closing for the season. Locals who built small businesses catering to Russian settlers watch their customer base leave one family at a time. That is not an economic problem you can patch with a subsidy. That is the slow erosion of an economic ecosystem. And once it starts collapsing, even subsidies cannot fully reverse it because the customers themselves are gone. It also means increasing isolation from basic informational flows. Internet infrastructure in Crimea relies partly on mainland connections that have been impaired by strikes. Mobile networks have reported outages. Public telegram channels that once carried Moscow's narrative are now filled with panicky local content from inside the peninsula. Even the most loyal local reporters are starting to lose faith. And when the information environment itself starts shifting, public behavior shifts with it. Before we close, one final ask. Like this video, subscribe if you want the next phase of this war explained without propaganda, and share it with one person who still thinks Crimea is just a frozen piece of a frozen war. So here's the truth. Crimea has not formally collapsed. The Russian flag still flies in Sevastopol. The occupation governor still gives speeches. The trains still run sometimes. The beaches still have visitors, fewer every week. But the version of Crimea the Kremlin sold to its own people is collapsing in public. The image of a stable, prosperous, permanent crown jewel is being replaced by another image. Emergency rules, bridge panic, empty shelves, rationed fuel, nervous tourists, insider defections, property listings up almost 30%. Settlers packing cars, children sent home, trains canceled, lights out. That is total isolation. Not a complete shutdown, but a complete erosion of the conditions that made Crimea feel like an asset, instead of a burden that grows heavier with every passing week. Each week brings new strikes. Each new strike tightens the squeeze. Each squeeze produces new queues, new shortages, new departures. And each departure confirms to the next household that leaving is no longer an overreaction. It is a sensible response. The bridge will keep queuing. The lights will keep flickering. The settlers will keep selling. And the slow, public, undeniable collapse will keep writing itself, one quiet family decision at a time. That is the story the West is sleeping on. And that is the story this channel will keep covering exactly as it unfolds, because stories like this one do not end quietly, even when the world around them keeps trying to look away. And if the day comes when even the loyalists in Moscow stop talking about Crimea as proof of imperial revival and start treating it as proof of imperial overextension, then the title of this video will not be a forecast. It will be a footnote. And the bridges, the roads, the resorts, the apartments, the Black Sea Fleet, and 1 million Russian settlers will be remembered as the moment the crown jewel cracked, slowly, in front of everyone, with no single dramatic blow required to finish the job. Just time, just pressure, just enough quiet decisions from enough ordinary people deciding that what they were promised no longer matched what they were actually living. And history will record it quietly as the night Crimea cracked open.